recording to the cloud. I think it's week 8. And grading sort of done. I've got a few more to get to, but not many. Hi, Kristen. And I will attack those as soon as I get them. You don't have any assignments due now for quite a while in here. So I just wanted to say that we're ahead compared to other classes. I had things due a little bit before spring break, so you didn't have to worry about working during spring break. And the next assignments aren't due until April 3rd, and then April 17th, your final paper. So you have 5 weeks to do other coursework and just the readings and your blog posts and other kinds of things like that. And also you're start thinking about the final assignments in here. I sent 4 really, I think, interesting videos from Amelia and from other people that were, I thought, exemplary. So thanks, Amelia. Amelia, are you going to be in USA come Thursday? You flying after class from Japan to USA? I can't hear you. What's wrong with my microphone? Can you hear her, Christian? No, no one can hear you. Okay.
Oh,
you
wait.
can hear. There we
Can
go.
you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I'm joining you from Kansas City tonight, and I thought we were on the same time zone, but we are not. You are whatever earlier.
We're in New York time here in Indiana.
Yeah, that's strange, but yeah, no, I'm joining you from Kansas City, and I'll be at the conference on Thursday. I'll be in Bloomington on Thursday and the conference on Friday.
So when you fly in, you lose an hour, or you driving in? Driving. You still lose an hour.
Yes, so I didn't really figure that, but yeah.
So we had a governor who's now was the president of Purdue, and he was governor for maybe 8 years. He did one good thing. He got our time zones to change. My man, Mitch Daniels, got us on Eastern time. I'm a Central time guy. I'm a Milwaukee guy. I like Central time, but he got us to move our clocks. I'd rather have us on Central, but at least we move our clocks like the rest of the world does, most of the rest of the world, except for Arizona and Hawaii, and Malaysia, and so certain parts of the world don't move clocks. So we are in New York time, DC time, Miami time, Atlanta time, I mean, Philadelphia time, Pittsburgh time, Boston time. I mean, we're in the time zone of most of this country now. And that's why I think it's kind of a good thing when I fly, you know. But I'm a Central time zone person. I much prefer Central time zone people are much cooler than Eastern time zone people. They're a little more laid back in the Midwest, you know, they chill out a little bit. And as you move further west, it gets more chill, you know. And more, my son lives in Portland, it's real chill, you know. So before I go into presentation mode here and talk about social constructivism, cognitive constructivism, just constructivism in general, does anyone have a comment or a question about the course? Anything they want to raise? Anything not clear? Okay. Last week and the week before, I talked about constructivism and mostly talked about applications. And I ended in the middle of one example or examples. And I was going to pick back up on that. But I have 2 theorists that I should be talking about eventually. And I think it might be good to start with a theorist and their theory, and then get to some applications either tonight, some more applications, and then to the other theorists next week. And we have 2 theorists, Piaget and Vygotsky, and a third one, Jerome Bruner, actually, that really cut across the constructivistic camp. Constructivism, for some people, it's a philosophy. Other people, it's a theory. For other people, it's good instructional practices. It's all that. And there are continua from being, you know, more focused on the individual learner constructing knowledge to looking at the social cultural setting in which that learner exists, from Piaget to Vygotsky. Piaget said that we have to wait in terms of developmental level before we can provide different forms of instruction, moving from kids who are good at concrete thinking to having them think with analogies and similes and so forth, getting them into analogical reasoning and formal operations, he called it. Vygotsky, on the other hand, said, we can push or prod or promote or provoke development to happen. Therefore, instruction could exist before people are ready for it. In effect, what's called proleptic instruction, teaching in anticipation of competence. I'm more in the Vygotskyan camp. Now, I'm trained in both. My degree is in human learning and human development. Both I double majored at Wisconsin. I didn't major in ed tech. I minored in it. So I'm more of an educational psychologist who likes both theories, Piaget and Vygotsky. But I think that most of people in instructional technology have sided with Vygotsky over time, for the most part, because that Vygotsky in somewhat is a pessimistic theory and an optimistic one, because he believes that people and resources can be provided in an environment to nurture new forms of thought to life. And that's kind of pessimistic, and then we need the resources. If they don't have them, we've got a big problem about accessibility today in terms of the internet. So in some ways it's pessimistic, but it also means that when they do get internet, they have a chance to, to move to different levels than they could have previously. And so that's why I'm kind of interested in it, because I like new technology tools, like Christian does as well, and Nicholas does, and so forth. I'm sure all of you are, once in a while, we find a new technology you want to try out. Well, how can we use it in a robust, enriching, collaborative, interactive way? So let's see if I can share my screen and find our friend Vygotsky in my slides here tonight. And there he is. So when I was in grad school in the late 80s, Vygotsky was the wave. I mean, you could get Vygotsky t-shirts and hats and pins. I mean, it was a thing, it's like going to a rock concert saying you're neo-Vygotskyan, When Stalin was in power, though, and Vygotsky had died early, he put all Vygotsky's work underground. They wouldn't let people read it because he wanted to be known in the field, Stalin himself, and not someone else. And it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that his works were translated and became widely accepted in the US. Like Piaget, Vygotsky was born in 1896, and he was Jewish, so he had very limited opportunities to go to college, and he had friends offering him their cards or their whatever that was that got him in the line, their toothpick that, their taller toothpicks, the cards that would let him go to college instead of them. In part, Vygotsky was a social studies teacher. He was a historian. In part, he was a psychologist. In part, he was a writer. In part, he was a meta-theorist trying to bring all different theories together. He wanted to rely on behaviorist theory as well as cognitive theory, as well as Gestalt theory, and he believed in all that, and he would work endless hours at night in the library to try and understand different points of view. That's his daughter on the left-hand side, Gita Vygotsky, and she wrote an article in the Educational Psychologist, I believe it was, or American Psychologist, called Understanding Vygotsky, or Understanding My Father. She wrote about growing up and how his endless work ethic and always thinking about different problems and attacking them. I used to use that article in a different class just to start discussion. But early on, Vygotsky and a guy named Luria went to rural parts of the Soviet Union or Russia at that time, trying to find ways to enhance literacy. And his theory is all about change and the dynamic forms of change, just like he was trying to create a psychology based on Marxism, and the notion of change is part and parcel to it. Whereas Piaget was focused on heading us all towards equilibrium, equal status. We have cognitive dissonance, and therefore we go find information out and move us towards a greater understanding by assimilating or accommodating new thoughts. According to Piagetian theory, we have to assimilate what we are learning into what we already know, our prior knowledge, or accommodate it, form new schemas or structures if it's something we hadn't seen before, like a three-legged dog, or if we've never seen an ostrich before, is it a bird, is it a mammal, whatever. So Vygotsky was more focused on provoking dissonance rather than trying to resolve the dissonance. So they have different emphases or focuses within their different psychological theories. And so, as I said, Vygotsky was part social studies teacher, historian, part psychologist, part educator, part writer, and part meta-theorist. He was a broad thinker. And Jerome Bruner, who passed away last year, the year before, at age 100 or thereabouts, he might be at 101. He said that if we just had Vygotsky, the world of psychology was changing. It was a critical era in time. But we had both Vygotsky and Piaget, who both were tremendous in terms of their outlook in psychology and their leadership and what they provided to us. Piaget studied his own kids to look at developmental changes over early childhood to age 18. Vygotsky looked at both kids and adults and tried to look at whether or not scaffolding in one's environment, the prodding, the hints, the instructional cues from the resources as well as from their peers. They might be more knowledgeable peers. He found more knowledgeable peers to be important from a neo-Vygotskyan point of view, and therefore heterogeneous grouping is important. From Piaget, it's more focused on homogeneous grouping. So there's a difference there as well. And so, and Vygotsky felt the instructor, the experts also can provide that. But the peers might be closer within what's he called the zone of proximal development, so as to nudge or prompt or new forms of thinking to life. So he had a broad theory of human learning and human development. He was trying to, again, find a platform, in this case, social cultural theory or at the time, this Russians called it social historical theory. And we had Russian scholars come to Bloomington 25 years ago to talk about the difference between social cultural theory and social historical theory. And there was from my standpoint, there wasn't a huge difference, but we are working within the tools and signs and symbols within society that exists today, so as to, again, rouse new minds to life. So we're moving away from a transmissive model of instruction towards one where we negotiate meetings, we interact with others, and so forth. As I said earlier, he was born in 1896, like Piaget was, like John Dewey's lab school was started in Chicago the same year, 1896. So that was a key year. And remember that first article we read for this class was John Dewey from 1896 or 8 or something like that. Vygotsky, though, unfortunately, worked so hard, he stressed himself out, and he died young, like age 37, 38, of tuberculosis. He did get treatments, but he also slept in the library late at night and didn't go home. He was constantly working on something. And so he founded journals like the Psychology of Art, and he was known as the Mozart of psychology at the time. He had followers. When he would go to a conference, I don't think any of the 16 students in R511, nor my 9 students in R795 have taken rose petals and put them in front of me as I went to Florida last week, as the students that Vygotsky had. He had students outside.
Is this a hint for the future?
You can do whatever you want. Just saying, he had students writing poetry, hanging out in the windows area just to listen to his lectures, so he was extremely influential and sought after person. So he worked in different institutes in psychology and defectology. I won't tell any jokes, and that's just old. So basically special education. He was working in the field of special education. While continuing to teach at the university, between 1925 and 1934, he worked with a lot of up-and-coming psychologists who made a big impact after Vygotsky passed away. Luria was one of them. Leontev was another who created something called activity theory, which you may read about later. If you're a doctoral student, activity theory becomes a way to analyze the data that you might have collected. So this gives, again, some of the different history. He started his career in 1917, which you might remember is the dawn of the Russian Revolution, right? A year or two later. He studied the people I mentioned during the behaviorist week, like Pavlov and like Watson and Wundt and others, and the Gestalt psychologists, Kurt Lewin and other Kurts out there, where there are three Kurts, I can't remember all three names, but anyways, the Gestalt psychologists and the cognitive psychologists and all. He was reading everything. He tried to, again, make sense of all psychological theory from a standpoint of his approach. So first of all, you have to understand lower order thinking, the response theory, learner response theory, stimulus response. In effect, that's called, lower order thinking, in order to then move us to higher order thinking skills that he was trying to promote so as to improve the literacy skills of the people of the Soviet Union and previous to that, Russia. He was the first modern psychologist to suggest there's an importance to the history and culture that one exists within in explaining one's skills, one's literacy, and so forth. Again, his works were published after his death. They were suppressed for a couple of decades, for more than 2 decades, by Stalin and by others. But his views, Vygotsky's views, were influential to other people in other points in time. I'm going to move my, hide my panel. There we go. So, he influenced psychology, he influenced education through his ideas about scaffolded instruction. And we have new terms that have come up in the past couple of decades, including cognitive apprenticeship, which I mentioned last week, with some of you included in your task 3 and task 4, distributed cognition, in that your learning exists, your network exists beyond the skin. Whereas with a purely cognitive point of view, we only think about what happens in our brain. From a social cultural viewpoint, learning extends beyond one's skin to our LinkedIn networks or WeChat networks or Line networks and so forth and so on. And again, he developed a methodology, or his followers did after he passed away, called activity theory. Let me click on this. And that was the people he worked with. Luria's the second from the left, and Vygotsky's the first row, the third from the left. And as I said, we had Vygotsky pins and buttons and T-shirts, and there was every week there was a new book on Vygotsky and understanding what he had to say about learning. And again, he was accepting of lower order thinking skills as being important, but he was more focused on the higher order thinking skills, and he tried to provide a psychological framework or understanding for how to foster those higher order thinking skills to life, how to push and prod them ahead before the learner was exhibiting them. So as we might look at Nicholas there, and Nicholas and I might take an algebra exam, and Nicholas and I both get 10 out of 20 right. And normal people would say, well, they're both flunking, they're not doing so good. Nick's not so smart, and Kurt's not so smart either. But then they give a couple little hints and nudges, and Nicholas gets all 20 correct, and I still don't get any correct, okay? So Nicholas would have a wider zone of proximal development than I would. And he's able, through some small hints and nudges, to move to the next level of development. And that's what social cultural theory is all about, trying to figure out where to provide the scaffolds, the hints, the job aids, and so forth. But we have to also understand our individual development is impacted by our current history, culture, and so forth. It's embedded in our social cultural context that we exist within. So learning is a matter of internalizing the language and action of others. So working with others, like Tom Hanks in Castaway talked with a volleyball he called Wilson. He had an outside other called a volleyball. He treated it like a person. Some of us treat robots like that the same way, or Alexa or Google Home and so forth, our chatbots. But most of us is human at this point. We still don't have really intelligence, despite ChatGPT. technologies that foster significant amounts of learning. So he emphasized the social interaction. That's what's called interpsychological processes. So before one can learn, one has to interact with others on an interpsychological plane. And it's a second step along the way that move discussion and dialogue to an intrapsychological plane. So learning happens in two phases. First in small groups, and that's why I was glad that Amelia worked with Masa on a project collaboratively, because you can learn a lot more by working as a team than working individually without talking to anyone. You can see other points of view and start internalizing the strategies or appropriating aspects of those strategies that others have exhibited, and you internalize the best fit for yourself at that given moment in time. So mental processes can only be understood within the understanding of one's social cultural context, the signs in our environment that we see all the time when we drive, when we read a paper, whatever the signs, and the tools. Today, the technology tools are much different than in Vygotsky's days. And I wonder what Vygotsky would have to say if he was to come back in 2023, if he was able to live to be the 126-year-old man. I wonder what he would say. Some people have lived to be 117, but I wonder if he would have lived like Piaget to the 1980s, you know, what he would have said about the tools that even the early PC days and so forth. No single principle accounts for development from a Vygotskyan point of view, unlike the equilibrium principle of Piaget that we'll get to next week or the week after. Kind of going a little bit slow through theory. So again, all learning, all development, I should say, appears twice. First, interpsychologically with others, with your teacher. You might solve, Nicholas might solve those math problems with his teacher's help. So that's one level of an understanding. That's it's not cheating. She's provided the support, or he provided the support for Nicholas to solve the problems. I couldn't solve them, right? But then Nicholas has to go home and work on those same worksheets or math problems or scenarios on his own. And that's when we see what he's internalized, what he's appropriated for his own mental functioning on an intrapsychological plane, you see. So, his concepts to me are really twofold then. He's understanding what happens with groups as well as what happens on an individual plane by yourself. And usually what Vygotsky says, we typically just understand fossilized skills, what we already know. That's what our tests test. They test fossilized. He said, we don't need to know fossilized skills. We want to know what's in the process of becoming, the next step, dynamic processes, dynamic assessments, you see, neo-Marxist kinds of points of view. Now, I can take off and put on my neo-Marxist glasses as my professor did at Wisconsin. And given today's political climate, I probably can't say neo-Marxism about 10 times in a row without getting in trouble here. I'm sure some state official will call me out on that. But actually, there were people banning Vygotsky because he was a neo-Marxist or was a Marxist trying to prove the political or cultural theory within psychology anyhow. So all higher mental functionings originate in our relationships with other people. So what this means is, don't go to Lower Potomac State University for your master's or your PhD. You come to Indiana, you go to Florida State, you go to Georgia, you go where other smart people go, because then you can raise your level of intelligence because you're going to be working with other really smart people. Lower Potomac State doesn't even exist. I couldn't even get in there with my test scores, unfortunately, but okay, that's another story. The human mind then is a product of our history, who we've interacted with, what we've interacted with, the psychological tools, as well as the technological tools, our metacognitive strategies, our learning aids, our study skills, to note take, to summarize, to ask questions, and so forth. So intelligence from a Vygotskyan standpoint is our capacity to learn from instruction and to move up based on that instruction. And the adult explaining something to a child is an essential aspect of cognitive development. Explanations, articulations, elaborations are part and parcel of what intelligence is, and getting the child then to take over that and explain it for themselves and verbal protocols is even more important. So the teacher's role is to challenge and then support the challenges. That's it. That's all teachers do, right? From this point of view, teacher's role is to challenge the students and to support those challenges. The supports can come through lectures, which they can come through assessments, they can come through forming small groups, they can come through competitions, they can come through collaborations. You know, the challenges and the instruction could come at any moment in time, right? So we want to push and prod beyond our level of competence, push beyond it, not be satisfied with who we are, but push beyond who we are to the next level of learning, the next level of beingness. You see, it's an optimistic theory because it's, you know, and it's a growth theory. It's you know, for all people who are stuck in a rut in their daily jobs, think about Vygotsky, what Vygotsky had to say about that, right? Find new outlets, take some micro credentials at night with other people and learn from them and move your psychological self ahead. So the most important index of a child's development is not what a child can do, but what he's able to do, what she's able to do through interaction with adults. That's the most important index of intelligence. You see, this is a whole new theory of human learning that we hadn't explored yet. So the teaching learning process is a social exchange, an interaction one. So we should use more breakout groups, Christian. You got to get prompt that as well. You know, children should learn a task not just by watching, but by having someone interact with us through the task and take over some control of the task and gradually be ceded control, total control of the task. You can initially learn from watching. I've not lectured on Albert Bandura for a few years on social learning theory. We probably should do social learning theory in a couple of weeks. I will talk about that. So the importance of social interaction to development and to learning a new language or whatever kind of skills that we have. So all learning from a neo-Vygotskian point of view starts in the social realm. He put the emphasis on the social side. Piaget did not. There's a big difference. But Piaget he had so much other things to do. He started to address the social towards the end of his life. It would have been important if he could have lived to be 125 years old. I'm sure he would have extended the social side too. So many people play off Vygotsky against Piaget for this or that. Hey, people are bounded in time and they have limited lifespans. They can't do everything. So just one had to emphasize the social, one more the cognitive side, an individual side. So learning is more of the interaction between the individual and the context that they're in. And then we have to think about, well, what's the unit of analysis? Most psychologists think the unit of analysis should be the test scores that we have, you know, the intelligence test scores. Sociologists think that we need to move up a level in institutions and the organizations and the enterprises. But that's the macro level, not the micro level, but it's the meso level that Vygotsky was interested in. As in between the micro and the macro, it's the activity setting, looking at the actual classroom that the student is working in, or the actual situation, the actual problem that they're solving, the environment out there in society, informally, how we learn on a day-to-day basis at cafes, which I'm looking at, or in airport concourses, or wherever we happen to be. So development does not happen before learning. Development precedes learning from his point of view. We move towards more expert-like understanding. Development is a conversion of the social relations, the social interactions, the social understandings into higher order mental functioning. And we're mediated, the mediational means, through the tools in our environment, through the signage that we see and experience in our environment. It's a process of converting that. So mediation is the process of converting the social to the individual. A tool is defined as something that can be used in the service of something else, okay? And a sign is something that stands for something else, indexical, iconic, or symbolic. So, and I'm running low on time because I know we want to take a huge break today. for my friend, the Donald's coming today. Not that Donald, but the Donald's coming. And we got the Clark Cosma debate. We have Clark Cosma coming in 2 weeks. This is a different Clark. That's Richard Clark and Bob Cosma. This is Donald Clark. Anyways, we have to provide the scaffolds, and I'm always thinking about my hometown of Milwaukee when the scaffolding fell and they built this Miller Park, this baseball stadium, and all these people died. So scaffolding's got to be sufficient to handle all the winds that might come your way, to support the learners. So you provide a heavy dose of scaffolding early on, and then wean the scaffolding away as they can take more control over the activity. So here's Vygotsky providing some scaffolding in the math problems that was provided to the young child there. So features of scaffolding. It's an instructional technique where the teacher models the strategy, the task, the problem-solving solution, and then gradually allows the student to take more control. And those students have been in my 546 class, like Christian and like Bo, who couldn't make it tonight. I talk about in that class reciprocal teaching, where the teacher models how to ask good questions, how to elaborate, how to predict what's coming next in the passage, how to summarize the passage. And then gradually the student becomes the teacher and they shift control. That's an example of instructional scaffolding, which Piaget would, or which Vygotsky would endorse. Scaffolding must occur in a collaborative context that honors the child's original intention. So what is this child really hoping to do? Not coerce them or co-opt them to do something else. The adult and child must be understanding of the ZPD that is in existence. They have to operate within the child's levels. It can't be too far beyond, and it can't be too easy for the child either. It's got to be somewhat in between. And we have to gradually withdraw our support over time, so wean away as the student takes control and independently can solve the problems. Now, in 1997, so a quarter century ago, I studied scaffolded support within an online case-based learning system that we designed in COW, Conferencing on the Web, which later became the Interplanetary Teacher Learning Exchange, the title project. We found these 12 or so forms of scaffolded support in our case-based learning system. We could ask direct questions, we could model or provide examples, we could praise them or give other forms of feedback, we could read, visit, or re-explain the structure, the task that they were to do. Each of these things, we could push students and to move on or to add more or to rethink their ideas. We could pause and ask them to reflectively write on what they learned. We could encourage them to discuss with each other and post so many responses to everybody else, like we're doing with our blog posts. We could manage the learners that are off task, that might be bullying other students in the discussion forum. We can manage that. We can acknowledge points of view. All these are different ways of scaffolding, and there are more. I don't think the one of them is you can summarize as one that's missing on this list. Do intermittent meta summaries. So we have a present level of development. We want to move kids to their potential levels of development. Look for the gaps between actual development and reality, right? And so here's what kids can do on their own on the left-hand side. And then we give them a little bit of support, or in Nick's case, or in Curt's case, give them a lot of support. And we can look at what they can solve with that extended support. And then there's things beyond what Nicholas can do, beyond what I can do, even if we're given extended handholding in a situation from our peers, or from adult, or from the computer system, or from ChatGPT, or something else. So ZPD is explained this way. I hope that starts to explain it. It's explained in many different ways. So this is another way to explain it. We've got our individual kind of learner on the bottom. We got our skills that we come to a problem-solving situation with, and then we have our ZPD of our, what we're about to be able to learn or solve or problem solve, with the support of others, adult guidance, peer guidance, instructors, and so forth. There's the in-between setting. Here's another way. I like this one the most, and this is in a book I used to use by Roland Tharp and Ronald Gallimore. This book won awards, national awards, and I highly recommend it. It's 1988, but if you like Hawaii, this is research done in the Kamehameha, I can't even pronounce it now, Kamehameha schools in Hawaii, on the Big Island. And, you know, kids in Hawaii tell stories. The culture is very story-like, anecdotal, and multiple stories can be told at the same time. I'm trying to be cognizant of time again. So you have coaches, you have peers, you have teachers, you have parents, you have experts, you have technology tools, you have other resources, you have open educational resources, you have robots and ChatGPT, and all this stuff are the assistance that can be provided to learners within their ZPD. And then you have your self-assistance, you know, talking yourself through a problem. And that can hopefully get us to move to the next level, to stage 3, which learning is automatized, internalized, fossilized. I used to call my dad a fossil, but I shouldn't have done that. My kids probably should be calling that to me now. If I had known what Vygotsky said, I didn't read Vygotsky when I was growing up. I probably wouldn't have called my dad a fossil. Anyways, and then we go through a de-automation purpose and learn something, another skill, and so forth. We move back through the system again in a recursive loop and learn different high order skills. Well, Tharp and Gallimore designed this model, and actually a new model. Christian, remind me, we should probably present, or you can look up the instructional conversation by Tharp and Gallimore. And maybe we can create a slide on the instructional conversation. It's a kitchen sink approach to instruction, but all of you in 511 should learn about the instructional conversation. It's much better than the Dick and Carey model or the Addy model, right? It explains a lot about learning instead of just about instruction. So here we are, pushing the young learner beyond what they normally we think they could accomplish, fossilized skills, to the edge, scaffolding and pushing them and nudging them to the edge of what they're able to learn at a point in time. This is something from Robert Slavin's old undergrad ed psych book that I stole when I used to use his book. And that's the same visual in a different, prepackaged in another way. So you'll see this visual all over the place. It's probably pretty good way to understand or wrap your head around what ZPD is all about. So some terms that come out within social cultural theories include shared space. Social cultural theorists look at the shared napkins that we might have in a restaurant. Now we go into Jamboards and Padlets and Miro and Canvas discussion forums and other social dialogue tools like WeChat and so forth to do their research, to look at intersubjectivity of learners, intersubjectivity, learning, understanding what others' perspective is at a moment in time, understanding the mutual knowledge that you have with other learners or other co-workers. So social cultural people will talk about shared space, intersubjectivity, social dialogue on authentic problems. So they look at discussions, they look at discourse, they look at content analysis of your Canvas forums. And they might look at tele-apprenticeships, how we're mentored from the outside, like Donald Clark coming in today will be mentoring us externally, Robert Cosma in 2 weeks, a couple other people from BYU next week, looking at the open free ed textbook project. So social cultural theories will also look at electronic assistance, digital assistance, like my 1998 book, Electronic Collaborators, one of the first books about collaborating in online environments, particularly web-based environments, as well as a scaffolded support that can take place both physical as well as virtual. And then our reflective processes that happen, the next loop, in the metacognitive loop that happens, how individually you might reflect or groups might reflect. They'll also look at collaboration within the ZPDs and what kind of collaborative help-seeking behaviors and help-providing behaviors exist within Canvas and other online discussion tools and online experiences. How we negotiate meaning with and among other people, and not just negotiate cognitively by ourselves, but with others in our psychosocial plane. How we are provided with choices within that psychosocial plane, as well as challenges and overcome the challenges, and eventually form a community of practice, community of learning, a COL or COP with other peers in the class, or in the work setting, it would be a community of practice with other experts. And they might use other forms of feedback than tests and direct tests. They might have portfolios of one's work and have dynamic forms of assessments. And the role of the instructor is not to teach, but to assist in the learning process. Think the little sisters of the poor. Think of the little sisters of the poor. Assist. We assist in learning, right? So we provide the task structuring. So constructivism then is concerned with the act of creating meaning. The constructivist argues the child's mind actively constructs new relationships. Our meaning is derived from negotiating with others and generating ideas and linking our concepts together. Seymour Papert, which I mentioned last week, worked with Edith Harrell in their book in 1991, Constructionism. So I already had this one up there, or aspects of this. So the human mind is part of, a cultural phenomenon, a social cultural phenomenon, and successful instruction matches the instructional materials and resources and prompts and hints to the ZPDs of the students in the classroom, of the students in front of you. Process of development is not our cultural specific, is not universal. Whereas Piaget had universal principles that apply to supposed to apply to everyone across cultures, have been shown to be false, actually. Vygotsky says no, it's going to vary depending upon points in time. So development's not universal, and so forth. I think, let me see how much further we have. Yeah, I better stop there and give us a break. So I will end there with implications. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to implications next week. And Christian can remind me of that, because we do need to take it off. Was that helpful, first of all? Did that clarify some aspects of what you may have heard before or read about or been wanting to learn about? So Amelia's shaking her head. In Kansas City, it makes sense. Nicholas, does it make sense here in Bloomington?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very similar to a lot of what, like, it made me think of, like, oh yeah, like I do, we do, you do kind of stuff in teaching that they give beginning teachers in lesson planning and stuff like that. Does most of that come from his theory? I guess I don't know a lot about where that comes from.
Sure. I mean, anything you're going to see in a school comes across different theorists. They don't just grab one theorist and say, this is the only thing we're going to use, especially in elementary school.
Yeah, but that idea of gradual release, proximal development, that's something that you think, you do deal with a lot in school.
Yeah. So if they do use the term proximal development or ZPD, then it does come directly from Vygotsky and thinking. But most curricula, you'll see aspects of it, scaffolding in particular, or they might call it instructional scaffolding or instructional support, right? Kristen shook her head up as well. So she's driving, or she's a passenger. I don't know which, but we shouldn't have her.
I am driving to Virginia from North Carolina.
Okay.
But yeah, it was good.
Don't get an
some
accident.
questions I had. No,
Okay. Okay. I've seen accidents in Virginia and North Carolina, and don't want you to be one of them. So anything, Jennifer? Okay. Christian? Okay. So
Nicholas had a question that he had posted in the chat.
Yeah, okay.
In reference to the Thorpe and Gilmore.
Yeah, what was the question?
Yeah, so I was just, as I was reading through the looking at that chart, going through the different stages of learning, I was thinking, like, as far as like when teachers put anchor charts on the wall, or they give kids visual aids that they keep with them at, whenever they're doing their math or things like that, would that kind of still be in step 2, where they're doing it with the assistance there, and then we wouldn't say it's fully independent until they don't have those visual aids? Or does that graphic organizer in itself kind of turn into a part of the learning, that if they know how to?
Yeah, the graphic organizer is two things. I mean, I remember back to cognitive theory and looking at, and we'll maybe talk about schema theory. I haven't talked about that in a few years as well. We'll maybe pull up schema theory and advanced organizers. We hear a lot in schools about advanced organizers. That's cognitive theory. That's not necessarily just Vygotsky in nature or social cultural in nature. providing that concept map, that mind map, or overview, or flow chart, or whatever it is at the front end, and maybe making them put it on display for later. That's priming knowledge. That's part of cognitive theory. Social cultural theory grabs cognitive theory. It's part of it, but it moves beyond it, in effect. And so everyone builds on the previous theory that was out there. But I would say those anchors, those conceptual anchors, are both social cultural in nature and cognitive in nature, in terms of learning theories. So last week I talked about John Bransford and his use of videos like Jasper Woodbury, talk about Indiana Jones videos to talk about how many Indiana Jones is the pit wide and all that. Those were anchors, video anchors. The same with those mind maps and concepts. Those are anchors to the instruction that one can revert back to and talk about. And Bransford is both a cognitivist, or was, he passed away a few weeks ago, and a cognitivist. He's our constructivist, I should say. He's a cognitivist and a constructivist. So if that's of interest to you, I'd read John Bransford. And there's an article from him last week, and I'd pick up other articles from John Bransford.
Okay. Yeah, I was also going to say, as far as reading Vygotsky, I didn't see it. I was looking through our readings to see if we had anything by him. Is there anything you would recommend that we read by Vygotsky?
His 78 book, that was a translated book from earlier times, Mind and Society, I think. And then his 86 book, Thought and Language, which would be harder of the two. I'd start with the 78 book if you can find it. It's a really interpretations by other people, folks in California and San Diego, University of California, San Diego, and other places. Those would be two places, but there's so many articles about him that basically could have been written by him. There's just Neo. Just could type in Neo Vygotskyan and see what pops up. Our Neo Vygotskyan summary on the state of education. I'm sure that would be a better place to start than most places you could go. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, or pause. I should stop it. Stop the recording. And this is the end of the lecture side or presentation side of week 8. We're going to go to Donald Clark next. Hang on.